Happy New Year and welcome to episode 8 of This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hunter Hallman. It's been a few weeks since our last podcast, so for today's episode, we'll be setting the scene for what we think will be the big issues in immigration for 2018 and what you should be on the lookout for. Today we're talking to Theresa and Cris of the immigration team about DACA and TPS, legal immigration reform, and immigration enforcement and security. Laura Hall from BPC Action is here as well to provide insight on how Congress might deal with some of these issues in the coming year. And don't forget, you can learn more about these issues and keep up with our work into 2018 by visiting our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. Let's start with the topic that seems to be getting the most airtime right now, and that's DACA. The latter part of 2017 was driven by the discussion of legislation for DACA and Dreamers, and now the administration's termination of TPS, or temporary protected status, for various nationalities. How do you guys see these issues continuing into 2018?
Well, thanks, Hunter, and Happy New Year, everybody. This is Theresa. We know that the issues are continuing in 2018 because they didn't actually do anything substantively on them in 2017. Congress was not able to come to agreement on any of these immigration issues at the end of last year, nor frankly on any of the other budgetary issues they had to get done. But there's still efforts underway. Just this week, of course, President Trump met with a bipartisan group of legislators to talk about the outlines of what might be a DACA deal. There's been some, I'd say, back and forth about what that meeting accomplished, but it definitely seems clear the president wants to see something done. So there's been a renewed effort on the Hill now with some of the leaders in the Senate and House, as well as a few different working groups to try to come up with legislation. The parameters of that legislation are somewhat unclear. The White House continues to insist on border security, and border security in the president's mind does mean something he will call a wall. Democrats in the House are still reluctant to give him a wall, but he's also raised other issues, things like chain migration, which he is using as a term to refer to family migration sponsored for, say, parents of U.S. citizens or brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, possibly the parents of the DACA recipients themselves, and the diversity visa lottery, an issue he raised after the terrorist attack in New York, where the perpetrator had come via a diversity lottery visa. Those issues, because they relate to broader issues of the Immigration Act, might be pretty big chunks to try to chew off on the DACA deal. And it remains to be seen whether they can get agreement among Republicans and Democrats to include those, or whether some Republicans might introduce other issues. The Senate has introduced a bill that includes additional interior immigration enforcement measures. And just today, Judiciary Chairman Bob Goodlatte introduced another piece of legislation that includes a lot of enforcement bills that had previously passed in the Judiciary Committee or passed the House, as well as a simple 3-year extension of the DACA program. So there's still some angling to be done by the parties on what the parts of this deal will be. But given the timeframes that we have, I think it's keeping it narrow is the best way to get it done. So they may have to decide from getting to agreement that they have to keep those issues more narrow to what they can agree on and set aside some of the issues they don't yet have agreed on to a later date.
I think Theresa raises a good point, too. This is Laura from the congressional side of things. The deal isn't necessarily just Republicans and Democrats. There's still negotiations going on, Republicans and Democrats and Democrats. So there's inter-party negotiations, right. Which just makes it pretty tricky. January 19th is, at the end of last year, January 19th is the new deadline for when all these spending bills run out. So technically, unless they pass another kind of punt and give themselves a little more time to work on the deal, we're looking at just next week is when the funding is going to run out, and hopefully DACA can be part of that mix as well.
Yeah. You also mentioned TPS, and I'll just say that the latest administration decision to terminate TPS status for El Salvadorans, about 200,000 of whom have temporary protected status in the United States right now, has also sort of come into this mix. And it's unclear what legislative solution might be offered for them. It's an issue of significant interest to a lot of Democrats. Some Republicans as well have raised the issue, particularly Republicans who have a lot of these folks in their districts. Some businesses have raised the issue because a lot of these people are in the workforce, and particularly in industries like construction and hospitality. And so there may be some pressure on Congress to try to address that in this deal as well. That's still kind of, I would say, in the nascent legislative stages to figure out what a solution for that might look like. But it does add to the mix.
Right. Yeah, I think for now, it's probably easiest if we keep the deal as narrow as possible. I worry, and I think a lot of folks here would agree, that the longer this drags on, the easier it is for other issues to get added to the table, which complicates things. So narrow and now is kind of what we're focused on.
So you had mentioned the bipartisan conversation from the meeting at the White House, which, when this is posted, will have been last week. And I know they discussed quote-unquote comprehensive immigration reform at certain points during this meeting, or a phase 1 and phase 2 of immigration reform. And what could that possibly mean for immigration reform in 2018?
Sure. So the president, during his first year, has made a point several times of talking about how he'd like to see our system be a merit-based immigration system. It's unclear exactly what he means by that. There have been references to, say, the Canadian or Australian points systems. He has endorsed a bill that was introduced by Senator Tom Cotton and David Perdue called the RAISE Act, which would eliminate all of our current immigration categories in favor of a very highly selective points system. That would be a significant reform to how our current immigration system works. So in terms of a comprehensive immigration reform legislation, again, in recent years, that term has been applied to bills that deal both with the undocumented population, the broad 11 million, as well as changes to legal immigration and enforcement changes, those sort of three pillars of comprehensive. It's unclear if the administration means that type of comprehensive reform or if they're talking about a comprehensive overhaul of the legal immigration system after this issue of DACA and border is dealt with. Again, still to be determined, but the president has been consistent about wanting to have this conversation. And there's been some indications, rumors, if you will, that he'll raise it again during the State of the Union. So it may very well be that he's looking to try to make a legislative push on legal immigration this coming year. I think our focus on DACA right now, as Laura said, is narrow and now because of the time frame and the situation of these individuals who are in a precarious state right now. But this broader conversation almost certainly, if it were to take place, would draw in a lot of these other issues. I don't know how that would be kept extremely narrow at that point, and then we'd be getting into a more comprehensive kind of conversation. I'd leave it to Laura to tell me whether or not in an election year Congress would have an appetite for doing this.
I think it's tough, right? I mean, I think a lot of members will kind of feel like for maybe some areas where an immigration vote is a tough one to take, they'll feel like they kind of already took their immigration vote if we do get a vote on DACA. But I think it's good that the conversation continues, right? There's a lot of sides of the immigration, from the diversity visas to high-tech visas, ag workers, we've got refugee issues. I mean, there's a lot of meat around immigration. I think it's great that the conversations are happening. I think the odds of doing a big comprehensive package this year are slim, but I think it's great to get the conversation started.
This can be a question for either of you, but do you think President Trump would go for the same type of broad bill we saw with the Gang of Eight bill in 2013, or would this be a complete departure, something totally new?
If we go by the list of immigration principles that the White House issued back in October, it included mostly changes to the legal immigration system and enforcement-related efforts. There was not really anything there that I saw that was for the broader undocumented population. Although in the past, the president has seemed sympathetic to some sort of legalization program once all these other things are in place. Frankly, a lot of Republicans have made that statement before too. Yeah, we could be open to legalization if we have enforcement, if the border is secure. So I think he might be open to that, but it doesn't seem like that's where he's going to start the conversation. But I can't imagine that the immigration advocacy community, that Democrats would let him end the conversation with just that. The status of the 11 million is a key issue for the Democratic Party, for the Democrats in Congress, and frankly for the 11 million and all of their families as well. And so I do think that would quickly come back on the table.
I agree. I think if he opens the door, he's got to be willing to talk about a lot of things. Mm-hmm. Rather than just the slices of comprehensive that might be the most appealing to him.
Sure.
Yeah.
So in addition to legislation that's on the table, Cris, can you walk us through what the Trump administration is doing that's affecting legal immigration, work visas, and other parts of the immigration system by regulations?
Yeah, so this is actually a really important component of talking about how the Trump administration wants to change the legal immigration system. We've been talking obviously about laws that the administration has supported, but it's also important to see how regulations that the administration's been implementing or proposed to implement will actually sort of advance its policy priorities. It's important to know that a lot of these regulations come under the Buy American, Hire American executive order that he issued in April 2018, where broadly the executive order basically instructed all the executive agencies, particularly DHS, Secretary of State at State Department, the Attorney General at the Department of Justice, the Department of Labor, to basically develop policies that would advance the interests of American workers and would also, tighten up the immigration system to basically advance their interests and also fight quote-unquote fraud and abuse that exists in the system. Taking that, looking at that comprehensively, what is actually being done. In terms of proposed policies, you're seeing them really target H-1B visas, the high-skilled visas that the administration has been criticizing for a long time that allows foreign workers to steal jobs from Americans is sort of the line of argument that they've been advancing. And under this, there are going to be various proposed policies that might be implemented this year, tightening definitions of what constitutes high skilled occupation, tightening definitions for employee relations, sort of introducing new ways of applying for H-1B visas that would actually limit the number of individuals who could apply. So all these big overhauls to really sort of ensure that the system, or at least the H-1B program, is awarding visas to what the administration deems as the best and the brightest. And so that's what they've been looking at proposing. There've already been some implemented policies already that have been impacting H-1B visas. In October 2017, USCIS introduced a new policy, or at least a new regulation, where they were basically stating that anybody who's adjudicating H-1B visas could actually basically look at the information that an employer had submitted and actually say, you know what, I want to take another look at this. In other words, if there's a renewal, the adjudicator is like, you know what, I want to take a look at this information again and send this information over. And prior to this policy, it was an optional measure, but wasn't necessarily something that was on the table. So, looking at the totality of this, you're basically seeing the administration really trying to sort of tighten up the awarding of visas to foreign workers, and like I was saying, largely in its opinion, to advance the interests of American workers. And so I think this is something that's really important. I think that, we're talking a lot about what's happening on the Hill, what's happening within the administration in law, but I think it's important to also be taking a look at regulations, because I think this is going to be one of the major stories of 2018 where people aren't taking a look at how the administration is changing the legal immigration system.
Yeah, I would just add to that some of the regulatory changes may bleed over into legislation. So, for example, we heard in the last few weeks that the administration might be considering changing how it interprets a statute from 2000 that allows somebody who's reached the end of their allowed H-1B time period of stay to keep extending it if they have a green card pending, right? So normally an H-1B worker can come for 3 years, they can have one extension for another 3 years, and then they usually would have to leave. But if during that period of time their employer sponsored them for a green card and they're waiting on that green card, this provision allows the DHS to extend that H-1B status until that green card becomes available. Now, for some workers from India and China primarily, that wait could be another 6 or 8 years. So there's a long extension period. The administration, or the rumor was that they were considering stopping that, so that at the end of that 6-year period, regardless if you have an immigration petition pending, you would have to leave the country and wait for it outside the country. That generated a whole lot of interest from a lot of employers who said, wait a minute, this would be very disruptive to our works. It would cause some employers to consider moving operations overseas to keep these people employed. And the administration just the other day said, well, wait, that was something that was floated. We're not really going to do that. But very clearly the community of interest there, the high-tech community, especially business interests, were ready to go to Congress to say, hey, you're going to need to deal with this. So the administration will try to do a lot of this regulatorily or by policy, changing the interpretations of laws in more restrictive ways that will eventually come back to, if there's a comprehensive immigration reform debate, to Congress as well.
Yeah, it's definitely not the flashiest of immigration issues, but it's kind of a constant undercurrent.
It is. Believe it or not, though, there are a lot of people paying very close attention to the regulatory agenda of this administration. They've been talking a lot about rolling back regulations on business. This is one area that they're actually looking to increase regulation on business in terms of how they hire foreign workers.
Yeah. And then just to end it, one more thing, just really quickly, is that the administration is actually also, they are shepherding some regulations that the Obama administration had proposed for the EB-5 investor visa. And they actually resurrected a May 1999 proposed regulation on the definition of public charge under immigration law. That was a Clinton-era regulation that was proposed, and so it's interesting to sort of see there are some continuities between the Trump administration and the Obama administration, these regulations, and apparently all things are new again. They wanted to bring back the 90s in policies, so here we go.
Here we go.
Retro's in.
Several of this administration's efforts at immigration changes also have been taken to court, such as last week's ruling on DACA, the cases against the travel ban, and efforts against so-called sanctuary cities. Where do we expect these court cases will go in 2018?
The short answer is I expect that many of them will make their way to the Supreme Court at some point or another. As you mentioned, there are a whole slew of fronts in this administration's battles in the courts. And it started, I think, with the travel ban. I think that's the one most people are familiar with. That did go all the way to the Supreme Court and back, and then back to the Supreme Court. And this administration has consistently said they will defend their actions in court. But they will consistently be sued by a lot of entities. So they have been sued over the various iterations of the travel ban. They have been sued by cities over the executive order on sanctuary cities, threatening to withhold government funding from cities that have sanctuary policies. They have been sued over some of these regulations that they're talking about, such as employment authorization for H-4 spouses and things like that. They were sued over the termination of the DACA program. The one thing I think that is true is that the courts are a long, slow way of adopting policy. It gives everybody sort of a feeling of, hey, a short-lived win. This court rules in my favor, then the next court overturns it. Then it's appealed up to the next court, then it goes back down. But it's a really long way to affect policy. Some of the things we've also seen from the administration is, well, when it appears that the court case is going to be long and difficult, we'll shift gears, we'll reintroduce something in another name or another way and hope that way to moot a court case. That's not been as successful either. The courts have sort of said, no, we understand that tactic, and it's still the version 2 of the same thing. But I think that this is just going to be an ongoing story that plays again into what the legislation is going to look like, what the political atmosphere is going to look like. Take, for example, the DACA ruling. The district court said that the administration was wrong in its belief that the Obama-era policy was not legal. So they challenged that position of the administration. And because they erred in thinking it wasn't legal, they too quickly decided to end it with too short a notice to the people who had DACA. So an administrative violation, if you will. So they said, okay, the administration has to now allow DACA recipients to file new renewals who weren't able to before. That sounds great on paper, but it's going to take the administration at least several days to actually be able to accept renewal applications again. They're going to have to figure out whether that extends to people who had DACA, had it expired, and are now filing again. Is that considered a renewal or a new application? Mm-hmm. And the Justice Department has already said we're going to appeal this ruling immediately to the district court, which could issue an emergency stay overturning it, which means if you filed something 2 days from now, you might not be eligible to file. Does DHS keep that application? Do they send it back to you? So again, in terms of actually having an impact of people on the ground who are in this limbo, the court cases are not going to be, I'd say, an immediate solution to any of that stuff. In the long run, however, I think the importance of all of this litigation is going to be some precedent decisions, probably from the Supreme Court, about what the actual balancing of authorities in immigration is between the executive branch and the legislative branch, between the federal government and the state government. And we may have some precedents going forward that determine the relationship between all of these entities in figuring out what the nation's immigration policy is going to be. And that will be very, I think, long-lasting impact and important.
It seems there's been an increase in immigration court cases, obviously, to say the least. Are we expecting more court cases with immigration in 2018? Do you think it's going to just keep on going up?
I think the court cases are there now will continue to wend their way through the courts. As far as new court cases, I think it depends on what new policies the administration implements. For every one of these regulatory processes that Cris mentioned, the Administrative Procedures Act is an entire body of law that has legions of lawyers who file cases in district court all the time on various types of regulations, and that's saying the government doesn't have the authority to do this, or they did it wrong, or they didn't follow their rules. So it's in one way sort of an easy, and I put easy in quotes, way of challenging any executive action. So to that standpoint, yes, I think there will be more litigation. How much of the litigation will be substantive and will actually result in changes again? The courts are not a fast way to get to that. And so I think in one ways it will keep the Justice Department lawyers very, very busy. It will keep advocates very, very busy filing these court cases. It will probably result in a lot more tweets from the president about how he doesn't like where the courts are going. But again, the be-all, end-all is it still comes back to the president and Congress and what they're going to do about the future of immigration policy in this country.
So to switch focus a little bit back to the travel ban, this administration has explicitly linked immigration and security multiple times. How do we think those issues are going to continue to play out over the course of 2018?
Well, as we've already seen, this administration is trying to link its legislative priorities to security, such as with the chain migration call or the diversity visa call. They're saying that because people who've perpetrated terrorist acts entered on one of these visas, that the entire visa category should be reexamined. That argument, carries some weight with some folks. I personally think that you can't say that an entire class of visa applicants is somehow more susceptible to terrorism. It's about how we screen and vet all visa applicants of all categories. But it's an argument they're going to continue to try to make because it resonates. It does have political resonance. And I think that members of Congress also share some of these concerns. And so
and unfortunately, they'll have continued opportunities because we'll probably continue to see a drip of little terrorist incidents or ways for them to kind of plug this issue again.
Yeah, that's the other thing. For every new incident that happens, as somebody who's been in immigration for a long time and was doing immigration after 9/11, unfortunately, we're in an era wherever any incident happens anywhere in the world, the very first question that many of us asked is, what was the immigration status of the perpetrator, right? Because we know it's going to be used in that way rhetorically for the debate on pro or con, one side or another. I personally think that that's bad for the immigration debate overall. Individuals who perpetrate these acts are individuals who perpetrate acts. Right. And they themselves are responsible for that, not their immigration category. Sure. But how we, the way we determine how we let people in the country does matter. The screening and vetting people does matter. The intelligence we gather to determine how we screen and vet people does matter. And we need to constantly be looking at those threats and figuring out how we address them. But the immigration system is a pretty blunt instrument to try to do that overall. And you're not going to reduce all risk to the country.
Sure. You can't screen someone for radicalizing once they get to the United States.
That's the other piece of this, right? This is all about how do you determine what future somebody 20 years down the line might do. If these people come as children, how do you determine that 20 years later they're going to find somebody on the internet they radicalize, and
Right.
it's not going to do that. So I think it will continue to be part of the debate, and it will continue to have to be something that looks at.
Yeah, and I think in a prior podcast, I think Theresa said something really succinctly in saying that this really relies on a countering violent extremism or anti-radicalization strategy rather than a visa strategy. And ultimately how you're able to engage with communities or engage with individuals using a range of resources to be able to see which individuals are being radicalized in the U.S. and why, and how you address that, I think, is part and parcel with a broader national security strategy. So I think that if you're just simply solely relying on a visa strategy, it's almost going to become like a game of whack-a-mole, because if one person comes in on a visa, they commit a terrorist attack on, suppose, assume an H-1B visa, all of a sudden that becomes a target. Or then it becomes a diversity visa. So at the end of the day, I think that it doesn't necessarily help with the debate if we're continuously just simply targeting different visa categories without thinking what's the underlying causes for these attacks.
And you also have to understand that the goal of the terrorists is to basically shut us off from the rest of the world, right? They want to make this about us versus them, whether it's the Muslim community, whether it's particular nationalities or countries, that feeds into their narrative. And frankly, their number one goal is not necessarily to get people into the country to do things. Their goal is to get American citizens to do this in our own country. And that's something that is, I think, of a much bigger concern that we have to pay attention to.
How might this issue impact refugees and other visa applicants?
Well, we're already seeing that, right? So the president has talked for a long time about extreme vetting, and as part of his travel ban, they proposed extreme vetting, and they have instituted increased screening and vetting for many populations, including the refugees. The implementation, finally, of Travel Ban 3.0 includes limitations on the admission from certain countries. And that has had an effect. We have seen some of the lowest levels of refugee admissions to this date so far in the fiscal year since the Refugee Act of 1980 was put in place. So only about 5,000 refugees have come in. The majority of them, I understand, are from Bhutan. It's not necessarily addressing, one, the worldwide refugee crisis. It's not even really addressing the backlog of people who've been waiting to come to the United States who have started that process. And it's not allowing the United States to be the world leader in encouraging other countries to take in refugees that we have been in the past. So it's having an impact there. It's also having an impact in non-refugee areas, right? So we're seeing fewer applicants come for student visas to the United States, particularly from the countries that had been targeted from the travel ban. That has lots of impacts, and not just to the schools and the amount of out-of-state tuition they get, but foreign students are one of the key ways that the United States exports our values to the rest of the world. Students come here, they learn, they live here, they understand what the United States is about. And for those that don't stay and make their lives here, they go home and bring that back to their country and say, hey, you know what? The U.S. is not a bad place. They're pretty nice people, and they share that with other people there. It's a relative. It's not only an inexpensive way to spread American values, it actually benefits us because foreign students who are educated here are a net export for the United States. There's your trade balance issue. So understanding the fact that we have fewer tourists coming in, just generally, because of increased screening and vetting requirements, that's dollars in our pocket. So many communities are reliant on tourism, foreign tourism especially. It's a significant part of our economy. And just fewer people wanting to come, wanting to go through the process. We all remember how we felt when we first had to start going through security screenings at airports. The airlines saw a precipitous drop in the number of people flying because they just didn't want to be bothered. And people who have an idea that they might want to come to the United States on vacation or for study or for work, they have those choices too, and they're going, is it worth the hassle? And not only are we losing out on their decisions to come here, other countries are benefiting. So countries like Canada and Australia are actively marketing their colleges and universities. You want to learn English, you want to be educated in a Western university, come on here. We'll happily take you. Same with, people who aren't able to get a work visa. China is actively encouraging people who want to start up businesses to go to China to start up their business rather than into the United States. Well, that could mean generations of lost innovation and productivity to the United States. It may take us a long time to regain the benefits that come with that. And I think when we talk about the immigration debate in strictly numerical terms, or what benefits it is to the United States in terms of workers in the United States, we miss some of these other national benefits that we gain from having people come to our country that we need to pay attention to.
Finally, this administration has moved to increase enforcement efforts against undocumented immigrants in the United States. Do you think this is likely to continue in 2018, and what could those impacts be?
So before we start talking about policies and what the administration may be doing, it's important to sort of set a context of what's actually happening in the border. In fiscal year 2017, we saw one of the lowest recorded numbers of apprehensions on the southwest border that were pretty historic, but at the same time were consistent with a drop in apprehensions on the southwest border that started around 2005. But I think what's really important for setting us up for 2018 is that after initially seeing a drop in the number of apprehensions from January through April 2017, you actually started seeing an uptick of apprehensions from May through basically the end of this year. And what you're starting to see in the media, at least, is news reports, is this the fading of the Trump effect, that somehow Trump's enforcement policies and his rhetoric had scared off individuals from coming into the country without any documentation. So I think it's sort of important to look at the numbers and the figures before you start thinking, well, where's 2018 going to go in terms of policy?
Yeah. The other thing that's true, though, is that the administration, for all of its border efforts, has really ramped up enforcement in the interior. And this is something the president has talked about. Arrests are up in the interior of the United States. And a lot of these arrests are coming not just of people who have been in jails and criminal apprehensions, but people just encountered by ICE in various places, Border Patrol checkpoints and that. And those are making the news a lot more. They haven't necessarily resulted in more deportations, in part because many of these cases have to go through immigration courts, and we now have a record backlog in the immigration courts. And so the administration is looking at ways to basically figure out how we can deport people faster. Do we have to go to immigration court with everybody? Or there more people can be deported administratively, reinstatements, and those kind of things. In addition, there's been an indication from Immigration Customs Enforcement that they're going to begin doing more worksite enforcement. And as a matter of fact, I think just today, ICE reported that they've done a major raid against 7-Elevens. And so I think that type of enforcement, worksite enforcement in the United States, has always been controversial because, in part because it doesn't always result in arrest and deportation of immigrants. It doesn't always result in fines and or penalties for employers of the immigrants. It does tend to result in a lot of people losing jobs, moving, companies sort of shifting around. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the Immigration Enforcement Service would actually talk about this as being a goal of worksite enforcement to just generate churn, was the term they used. And what they meant by that was you increase the cost of illegal employment of immigrants by making it riskier to do so. The immigrant may be caught, they maybe have to move on. You as an employer have to invest in new hiring, and that makes it just less attractive to employ. And that ICE may be going back to that sort of strategy when it comes to enforcement in the workplace. So if that is where they're going, I think you'll continue to see that effort unless or until it becomes a political problem for the administration. Enough businesses get upset, they go to Congress. That's also been true in the past. I would also look to see how many prosecutions of employers actually happen, how many fines and penalties are assessed against them for this effort, how many people are actually deported versus just going into a work site and not arresting a lot of people. and what effect it has on the overall immigration debate. I think it will probably push a lot of Democrats, certainly, to try to work more quickly toward a broader legalization effort.
Thanks everyone for joining us and for shedding some light on what 2018 might bring for immigration policy. We're now back on our every other week episode schedule, so join us back here in 2 weeks. And you can find This Week in Immigration by searching Bipartisan Policy Center on iTunes or your favorite podcast platform.